The Callaway Promise, Part 1. The Woman Nobody Saw. The first thing anyone noticed about the iron anchor was the smell, stale beer and pine cleaner, and something older underneath, both the particular exhaustion of a place that had absorbed decades of people sitting alone with their thoughts. The neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, half its letters dark, casting a pale orange glow across the gravel parking lot on a Friday night in late October. Flagstaff, Arizona. Elevation 6,900 feet. Cold enough at night that your breath made small clouds even in autumn. Nobody paid attention to the old pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. Nobody paid attention to the young woman who climbed out of it, locked the door by hand because the fob had stopped working 2 winters ago, and walked toward the entrance with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had made this exact walk before and intended to make it again. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches, 119 pounds on a heavy day. She wore jeans worn white at the knees, work boots that had seen the underside of more engines than she could count, and a canvas jacket the color of Dry Creek mud. Her dark hair was pulled back without ceremony. No jewelry, no phone in her hand. She moved the way people move when they are not performing for anyone, with an awareness in her eyes that belonged to someone who had been taught to read rooms before she learned to read books. Her name was Reese Callaway. She had been coming to this bar on this night for 2 years running. She would come again next year and the year after that for as long as her legs would carry her. This was not a habit, it was a promise. And Reese Callaway did not make promises she did not intend to keep. She pushed through the door. The iron anchor was a dive in the truest sense, not the sanitized kind that college bars advertise with faded memorabilia and sticky menus, but the real kind. The floor was genuine wood worn smooth by genuine boots over genuine decades. The bar top was scarred with rings left by glasses held by hands that had genuine problems. The jukebox in the corner played a George Strait song at low volume, and nobody was really listening, and that was fine. That was exactly how a place like this was supposed to work. It was a place for people who needed to be somewhere without needing to explain why they were there. June Briggs was behind the bar. She was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through her brown hair that she had stopped fighting sometime around her 45th birthday. She moved behind the bar the way experienced bartenders do, with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had learned that most of what people needed from her was not complicated. A clean glass, a full pour, the grace of not asking questions that don't need answering. She saw Reese come through the door and reach for a glass without breaking stride. Reese made her way to the corner table, the same one every year, tucked against the back wall facing the entrance with a clear sightline to the front door and the emergency exit beside the jukebox. She pulled out the chair that faced the room and sat with her back to the wall. She did not take off her jacket. She set her keys on the table. Then she reached into the breast pocket of her jacket and placed something on the table in front of her. It was a dog tag. Military issue, the standard oval of pressed steel on a worn chain. The chain was old, the metal dull with years of contact against human skin. The embossing read Callaway Jr. blood type, service number, a faith designation. Reese looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded her hands around it loosely, the way you might cup a small flame against wind, and she looked up at the room. June brought the water without being asked. Set it down without comment. She started to move away. Then she stopped. She looked at the dog tag in Reese's hands. Something crossed her face, recognition and a careful sorrow that only appears when people are trying to be respectful of someone else's grief. He used to hold it the same way, June said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft, June. Briggs was not a soft woman, but calibrated low the way you speak in a library or a church. When he sat right there, he'd set it on the table and then pick it up again. Like he couldn't decide whether to put it down or keep it close. Reese looked up at her. I recognized you, June said. Not from a photo. He never showed me a photo. I recognized you because you walked in the same door he walked in, sat in the same chair, and put that down on the table exactly the way he did. She paused. He talked about you. He didn't explain much. He just said you were the best thing he ever did. Said it the way people say things they're completely certain of. Reese held very still. 2 years she had been coming here. 2 years June had brought her water and let her sit. Neither of them had named it until tonight. Thank you, Reese said. The words were few, but they were real. June nodded and went back to the bar. The iron anchor settled into its Friday night sounds. Ice in glasses. Low conversation from the two men at the far end of the bar. The hiss of a tap. George Strait gave way to something by Waylon Jennings, a little more mournful. Reese sat with her water and her dog tag in the stillness of someone who is not entirely in the room they appear to be in, when part of them is somewhere else, and the somewhere else is years away. Master Chief Jack Calloway had been dead for 2 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He had died in a hospital bed in Phoenix from a cancer that had started in his lungs and spread with the quiet efficiency of something that had been patient for a long time. The doctors had used words like burn pit exposure and prolonged contact and service-related. Jack had used no words at all. He had simply lain in the bed and held Reese's hand on one side and Miriam's on the other, and the three of them had been as quiet together as they had learned to be over years of practice. He had been 67 years old. For 40 of those years, he had been in various official and unofficial capacities one of the most effective naval special warfare operators the United States had ever produced. The kind of man whose file at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, ran to several hundred pages, most of which bore more black redaction bars than legible text. He was the kind of man who, when he walked into a room, other experienced men noticed something shift in the air, though they could not always have said precisely what. He had also been the kind of man who, when his daughter was 8 years old, had begun teaching her things, not because he wanted her to be a soldier. That was the misunderstanding people made about men like Jack Calloway, that because they were what they were, they wanted to make more of what they were. Jack did not want that. What he wanted was simpler and harder to explain. He did not want his daughter to ever need to be saved. So he taught her, with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, and over years, not weekends. He taught her to shoot not the way people learn at a range for an afternoon, but genuinely with an understanding of wind and distance and breathing and the discipline of waiting for the right moment, even when every instinct says to move now. He taught her field medicine tourniquet application wound, packing the signs of shock. He taught her to read terrain and read rooms and recognize the specific tension that precedes violence, which has a sound and a smell distinct from ordinary aggression if you know what you are looking for. He taught her to be the calmest person in any situation she entered. He told her more than once the most dangerous thing in any room is not the biggest man or the loudest voice. It is the person who has already decided what they will do and is simply waiting for the right moment. And then 2 months before he died, he had asked her to stop using it, not to forget it. You could not unknow what Reese Calloway knew by then, but to choose not to use it as a weapon. He had held her hand in the hospital room and said, "The world has enough pain in it already. Don't add to it, not with what I gave you. What I gave you is for protection, not proof. Promise me." Miriam had been on the other side of the bed. She reached across and took Reese's other hand without speaking. Her hand said what words would have made smaller. Reese had promised, both of them. The promise was two-layered, impossible to peel apart, one layer to her father, one to her mother, both woven together in that hospital room until they were a single thing. She was sitting with the weight of that promise when the door opened. She heard them before she saw them clearly, not because they were loud, though they were, but because the sound of a group of men moving with the arrogance of people who believe a space belongs to them by right is distinct from any other sound a room makes. It has a frequency to it, a density that precedes the actual noise. There were 8 of them. They wore leather vests with a patch. She noticed immediately a steel gray wolf's head on black background, below it the name Steel Phantoms in block letters. They moved through this door with the confidence of men who had entered rooms like this before and found them yielding. Most of them were large. They carried themselves the way men do when they have organized their identity around the idea of physical intimidation. The one at the front was the largest. 6'2", approximately 230 pounds, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and a scar running from his left cheekbone to the corner of his mouth, pale and old, the kind that had a story and knew it. He was 42 years old, though he looked older in the way that men do when they have spent years in weather and in confrontation. His vest carried additional patches, rank markings within the club, a president's patch on the left chest. His road name was embroidered below the wolf razor. His real name was Raymond Brennan. That was not a name he used. He swept the bar with the practiced eye of someone assessing territory. He found it satisfactory. The men already there were the right kind, the kind who would look at their drinks and find them very interesting. The corner table with the woman in the mud-colored jacket was the only variable worth noting. He filed it and moved on. He directed his group to the center of the room, pulling tables together with the cheerful noise of people who do not consider whether noise is welcome, and within 3 minutes the iron anchor had reorganized itself around them. The 2 men at the bar migrated toward the door. The couple by the jukebox became very still. The George Strait song ended and nobody got up to choose another one. June stood behind the bar and polished a glass with focused, controlled attention. Reese did not look up. For 20 minutes this held. The Steel Phantoms ordered and drank and were loud in the way that was not yet a problem, but was auditioning to become one. Reese sat with her water and her dog tag and waited for the night to reach whatever it was going to reach. Then one of the men near her table, not Brennan, one of the others, a heavy-set man with a laugh like an engine turning over, knocked her jacket from the back of her chair. Whether it was accidental was not clear. The effect was the same either way. The jacket hit the floor. The men near her laughed. Reese leaned down and picked it up. She placed it back on the chair. She did not look at the men who laughed. This was, in her experience, the only correct response. The correct response to provocation designed to produce a reaction is to refuse to produce the reaction. Escalation requires fuel from both parties. She had learned this in theory and in practice over years. She applied it now. But Raymond Brennan had seen her lean down and pick up the jacket, and he had seen her deliberate non-reaction, and something about it interested him. He had spent enough years in rooms like this to have a calibrated sense for what different kinds of non-reaction meant. Most of them meant fear. This one did not feel like fear. He was not sure what it felt like, and that uncertainty worked on him. He stood up. He crossed the room to her table with the slow deliberateness of a man who wants to be seen moving, who understands that his approach is itself a statement. He stood at the edge of her table. He looked down at her. She was looking at the dog tag in her hands. "I don't think I've seen you in here before," he said. His voice was a baritone, kept low for effect. "This is kind of a regular spot for us." Reese set the dog tag on the table. She looked up at him. "I've been coming here longer than you have," she said. Her voice was even, not defiant, not frightened. The voice of someone stating a verifiable fact. Brennan studied her. The evenness irritated him more than defiance would have. He glanced down at the dog tag. "What's that?" He reached down before she could respond and picked it up, turned it in his thick fingers, read the name. Calloway. He set it back on the table, not where it had been, but slightly out of her reach, a small, territorial adjustment that was more reflex than thought. "You somebody's daughter." "That's my father's," she said. Brennan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited. Two of his men drifted over without being called. The social architecture of the room reorganized itself around her table. Reese breathed in. 4 counts. Hold. Slow. She had practiced this breathing since she was 12 years old in the high desert of Utah at 3 in the morning, with her father beside her, and the practice was in her now like a calibration that ran, whether she attended to it or not. She looked at Brennan with an expression that was not warm and not cold, but simply present, paying close attention without declaring anything about what the attention was for. "This table's been ours on Fridays," Brennan said, leaning forward with his forearms on the wood. "House rules." "There are no house rules like that here," Reese said. "June runs this place." Brennan glanced at the bar. June was polishing a glass with focused attention, the particular stillness of someone watching everything and processing it. He looked back at Reese. He reached out and picked up her glass of water. He examined it with theatrical curiosity, then set it back on the wrong side of the table out of her reach next to the dog tag. A small inventory of displacements, each one a test. She did not reach for either of them. He stood up. He walked around the table to her side. He reached down and took hold of the front of her jacket, not violently, but with the slow authority of someone demonstrating capacity. The jacket came open, and then Brennan stopped. He released the jacket and stepped back. His eyes were fixed on the interior lining where the fabric had been folded and stitched to display a small patch, 4 inches by 3. Faded with age but precise in its detail, a number, a designation identifying letters. SEAL Team 3. He stared at it. His face was not smart enough to hide that he did not know exactly what he was looking at, but it was smart enough to register that the patch carried weight he did not have the context to measure. He looked up at Reese. She was looking back at him with the same steady attention she had maintained throughout. She had not moved. She had not pulled the jacket closed. She sat with the patch visible and her hands flat on the table and the dog tag between them. "What is that?" Brennan said. Reese said nothing. From the edge of this group, a man Reese had been tracking since they walked in took one deliberate step toward the door. His road name was Drifter. His real name was Cole Weston, and he was different from the others in ways that had been clear to Reese from the first minute. Quieter, standing differently with eyes that made assessments rather than broadcasts. He was 35 years old, and he moved with a residual precision that did not come from the club. He had seen the patch. His face changed when he saw it, a flicker of something genuine and unguarded crossing the practiced blankness he wore in the group's company there, and gone in under a second. He took another step toward the door, then passed through it into the parking lot. Nobody in the group noticed. They were focused on the table. June Briggs noticed. She waited 30 seconds. Then she used the natural movement of helping a patron as cover to drift toward the far end of the bar, closer to the door of the back office. She kept her eyes on the room. Brennan and his men were clustered around Reese's table. She could not hear what was being said, but she could read the posture of it clearly enough. She had known Jack Calloway for 12 years. He had sat at that corner table and drunk water and never caused a single problem for anyone in this room. He had left her a card with a number on it and told her to call if there was ever real trouble, not bar fight trouble. He had been specific, but the kind of trouble where real meant something different. She had kept the card in the drawer under the register because Jack Calloway was not the kind of man whose requests you dismissed without reason. She moved into the back office, closed the door most of the way, found the card in the drawer. Her hands were steady. She was not the kind of woman whose hands shook, but her jaw was tight and her breathing was deliberate. She dialed the number with the careful attention of someone who understands they may not get a second chance. It rang once. A man's voice answered, not warm, not cold, simply professional, the way voices sound in rooms where professionalism is not a performance but a requirement. Operations. My name is June Briggs, she said, her voice low and controlled. I'm calling from the Iron Anchor in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm calling about Reese Calloway, Jack Calloway's daughter. There was a pause, not long, the kind of pause that is not confusion but recalibration, the pause of someone shifting from one mode to another. Is she safe right now? The voice asked. There's a group of men. They're escalating. She's not fighting back. She's just sitting there, but they won't stop. Stay on the line, the voice said. Don't hang up. Keep your head down and let us work. She heard other voices in the background then. Lower faster with the clipped efficiency of people shifting modes. She heard her location repeated. She heard a name, Calloway. And then she heard something she did not understand, 3 words delivered with the flat urgency of a switch being thrown. Code Trident active. She had no idea what that meant. She pressed her back to the wall and looked through the cracked door at the bar, and she was beginning to understand, in the way that people understand things they have no framework for, that it meant considerably more than she had expected when she made the call. In the bar, Brennan had grown tired of the quality of Reese's silence. He stood from the chair he had taken. He walked around the table to her side. He reached down and took hold of her arm. She let him. This was the thing that would have frightened anyone watching who understood what they were looking at. Not what Brennan was doing, but the quality of her not doing. She allowed him to pull her to her feet. She went with the movement without resistance, without stiffness, with the fluid compliance of someone who is managing a situation rather than reacting to one. On her feet, she was a full foot shorter than him, and the room contained nothing in her face that registered this as a problem. She was counting. She had been counting since he first sat down. She knew the layout of this room. She had assessed it when she walked in, as she always assessed rooms, not consciously now, but automatically, the way you breathe. She knew where every person in the bar was standing. She knew where Brennan's men were relative to the exits. She knew the bar top had a solid wood corner at the right angle, that the space between the last table and the jukebox was 42 inches, that the 2 men at the far end of the bar were not threats and would not become threats. She could end this, not neatly but decisively. 3 movements, possibly 4. Brennan first because of his size, then the 2 closest, then the room would reorganize around what had happened and the rest would not matter. She stood in his grip with all of that knowledge arranged quietly in her mind like tools on a pegboard, each in its place, none of them in her hands. Because her father's voice was in her head, because her mother's hand was in her memory, because the promise did not have exceptions written into it, and she had not asked for exceptions because she had not believed she would be standing here. She looked at Brennan. He looked back at her with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has established something important. Nobody's coming for you, he said. Whatever that is outside, it's not for you. You understand, nobody sends a response for a girl nobody knows, sitting in a bar nobody's heard of. He was convincing himself as much as he was telling her. Reese looked at the dog tag on the table, still where he had displaced it. They're already here, she said. The words were quiet, flat with the particular certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than making a claim. From outside, through the walls of the Iron Anchor, came the sound of engines. Multiple engines, high performance, approaching in coordination rather than at random. Not staggered the way civilian traffic arrives. Moving together. The sound built and then stopped. The silence after it was a different kind of silence than the room had held before. Brennan felt it. His grip on her arm did not tighten, but something shifted in his posture, the first genuine uncertainty of the evening arriving now like a change in air pressure before a storm. Through the front windows, light expanded across the parking lot. Steady white light, cold and precise without the red and blue of law enforcement. The light of something that was not asking permission. Reese Calloway did not look at the windows. She looked at the dog tag on the table. She waited. Part 2. The Price of Silence. The Naval Special Warfare Command Center at Coronado, California, operated on a different relationship with time than most places. Outside its walls, Friday nights had their particular quality restaurants filling traffic, thinning people making the small calculations of leisure. Inside, time was organized not by the clock, but by the status board, and the status board did not care what day it was. Master Chief Doyle Garner had been behind the operations desk for 11 years. He was 54 years old, built like a man who had once been exceptional and had maintained enough of it to remain formidable with close-cropped gray hair and the stillness of someone who has applied discipline long enough that it becomes indistinguishable from calm. He had learned to assess incoming information the way a surgeon reads a patient, quickly, without drama, looking for what was actually significant beneath what merely appeared significant. The call from June Briggs came in at 9:47 p.m. Pacific time. He listened. He noted the location. He noted the name. Reese Calloway. He pulled the file. It required 2 authentication steps even from his terminal. When it opened, the first thing he saw was the priority contact designation and the name above it. Master Chief Jack Calloway, USN retired. Garner sat very still for a moment. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he was not experiencing sentiment now. What he was experiencing was a specific recalibration that happens when a name you have filed under history reasserts itself as present tense. Jack Calloway's file ran to several hundred pages, most of which were redacted to the point of abstraction. He was the kind of man whose reputation arrived in rooms well before he did, and whose reality, when you finally encountered it, turned out to be larger than the reputation. But Jack Calloway was dead, 2 years and 2 months. His daughter was in a bar in Flagstaff being detained by men whose threat level was by any reasonable operational assessment manageable by local law enforcement. Garner reached for his phone. "I can have Flagstaff PD there in 8 minutes." He said not to anyone in particular, but to the room, testing the decision by stating it aloud. "Put the phone down." Commander Warren Holt's voice came from the doorway. Holt was 43 years old, lean, in the way that men are lean when they have never stopped moving, with the kind of face that registered information and gave nothing back. He had been at the adjacent station reviewing after-action reports, and he was already standing, already moving toward the central map display, which told Garner that Holt had been listening longer than he indicated. "Sir," Garner said, "the situation as reported is a bar altercation. Local authorities are equipped." "Jack Calloway's daughter," Holt said. He was looking at the status board. He did not look at Garner when he said it. "With respect, Commander, we can't scramble a QRF every time a family member of a—" "I served with Jack at Coronado," Holt said. 98, 2 years. He turned from the board. His face was not angry. It was decided, which is different. Jack Calloway went into a drainage ditch in Kuwait with a separated shoulder and 2 broken ribs and carried a man out with 1 functional arm. I reviewed the after-action report on that operation 3 times because I could not make the geometry of it work. He looked at Garner directly. "We are not calling the local sheriff." Garner held the look for 2 seconds. This was not insubordination, and Holt was not inviting debate. He was stating what happened next. "QRF is on standby rotation," Garner said. "Get them to the vehicles." Garner picked up the radio. Holt moved to the file on the screen. He read quickly, extracting operational information from dense text with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to find the narrative underneath the administrative language. He read through the commendations and unit assignments, the long inventory of a career that had crossed every theater where the United States had found itself in the business of quiet, necessary violence. He read through the redacted sections, which were substantial. Then he found the paragraph that had survived the redactions. It was in a section labeled Operation Classification Declassified Partial, dated March 2019. Someone had reviewed the file years after the events and made a determination about what could be released. This paragraph had survived that determination. February 27, 1991. Kuwait. Classified extraction operation coordinates withheld approximately 12 kilometers from Kuwait City outskirts. Team encountered unexpected hostile contact during egress phase. Master Chief Calloway sustained 2 fractured ribs and a dislocated right shoulder during the initial exchange. Despite these injuries, he maintained suppressive fire at the extraction point for 11 minutes, enabling the evacuation of 4 wounded team members and 1 attached Army Ranger. 1K IA Corporal Thomas J. Crawford, USN Crawford, died of wounds sustained in the initial contact. The attached Army Ranger Sergeant First Class Edmund Brennan, 75th Ranger Regiment, survived and was evacuated. Master Chief Calloway was the last man on the extraction point. Holt read it twice. Thomas Crawford, Edmund Brennan. He noted both names the way you note things whose relevance is not yet clear, but whose weight suggests it will become clear. He thought about Jack Calloway being last off an extraction point with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder. He thought about a corporal named Thomas Crawford who had not made it to the helicopter. He thought about the kind of grief that accumulates from a loss you cannot undo and cannot fully explain to anyone who was not there, how it travels forward through years and decades and settles into a man's body alongside the discipline and the competence becoming part of how he moves through the world. He thought about a dog tag on a table in a bar in Flagstaff. He closed the file. "Wheels up in 5, he said. He was already moving toward the door. The SUVs left Coronado heading northeast, and in the lead vehicle, Holt rode without speaking. The men around him understood and matched it. They had the kind of alertness that is not agitation, the readiness of people who have learned that the time between departure and arrival is not wasted but preparatory, and that preparation from the outside looks like silence. In the bar in Flagstaff, the space between was not silent at all. Brennan had not released Reese's arm when the lights came through the windows, but he had stopped talking. He stood at the edge of her table, and the calculation on his face had become complicated in a way it had not been an hour ago. He was a man who had walked into this building with a clear understanding of what the night contained and was discovering incrementally that his understanding was wrong in ways he could not yet fully account for. He looked at his men. They were looking at the windows. "It's nothing," he said. His voice had the tone of a man telling a room something he is not entirely certain of himself. He turned back to Reese. She was looking at the dog tag on the table. She had been looking at it with the same quality of focus throughout, a steady, almost meditative attention that was beginning to affect him in ways he could not name. It felt like being assessed by something that had already completed its assessment and was simply waiting for events to catch up. "Who are you?" he said. It came out differently than he intended. He had meant it as a challenge. It arrived as a genuine question. Reese looked up at him. "Nobody," she said. "That's the point." He did not understand what she meant. He looked at the windows again. Whatever had arrived in that parking lot had not moved. No siren, no radio chatter bleeding through the walls, none of the sounds that precede a standard law enforcement contact. Just the lights and the silence underneath them. His grip on her arm tightened slightly, the reflex of a man whose options are narrowing and who does not know it yet. Reese was counting, not seconds, variables. She had been updating her assessment of the room continuously since Brennan first stood up from his table, and the assessment was current and complete. She knew the exact position of every person. She knew the angles. She knew what was possible and what it would cost and how long it would take. She also knew something else, and it had been running underneath the tactical calculation the entire time, the way a river runs under ice, present constant exerting pressure, even when the surface shows nothing. She was 9 years old, standing in the backyard of a house in Virginia, and Jack was behind her with his hands on her shoulders. She had just asked him why they were doing this again when she already knew how. Because knowing how to do something and knowing when not to do it are completely different skills, he said. The second one is harder. It takes longer, but it's the one that matters most. She was 12 and they were in high desert in Utah, and it was 3 in the morning, and Jack had woken her because he wanted her to feel what the terrain told you before he explained what it was saying. She was 17 at a range outside Quantico, and she had just put 5 rounds into a target at 300 yards in a crosswind. Jack had not said well done. He had said, now forget, you can do that. The whole point is that you never have to use it. She was 24, sitting beside his hospital bed, his grip still stronger than it had any right to be. The world has enough pain in it already. Don't add to it. Not with what I gave you. What I gave you is for protection, not proof. Promise me. And Miriam's hand coming from the other side. She held the promise steady in her mind and looked at Brennan and waited. He was still talking something about the parking lot and whatever was outside and why it did not concern her, but she was only tracking the words at the surface. She was tracking him underneath the words. His breathing, the micro shifts of weight that told her what he was about to do 3 seconds before he did it. She had been reading men this way since her father started teaching her, and the reading was automatic now, as involuntary as blinking. The back door of the bar swung open. Cole Weston came through it. He had been in the parking lot for 4 minutes. He had seen what was in the parking lot. He came through the door with movement that was different from anything he had shown all evening. The practiced looseness was entirely gone, replaced by something directed and deliberate that several people in the room recognized, without being able to name it, because it was the movement of someone who has stopped performing and started operating. He walked through the group of his own people as if they were furniture. He walked to the space directly beside June Briggs, who had come around the bar and planted herself between Reese's table and the cluster of Brennan's men. The two of them stood there together, a 51-year-old bartender and a 35-year-old man who was done pretending to be something he was not. Brennan looked at Weston. His eyes narrowed. In 3 years of riding together, Cole Weston had never stood on the wrong side of a line where Brennan was standing. This was the first time the wrongness of it registered on Brennan's face as something beyond surprise, a recalculation of something he had considered permanently settled. "Cole," Brennan said. One word, the tone of a man reminding someone of an arrangement. "Let her go, Ray," Weston said. His voice was flat with a seriousness that had nothing to do with anything he had brought into this bar tonight. Not aggressive, not placating, simply direct. Brennan's grip did not loosen, but he did not move. "You know what that patch means," Weston said. He was not asking. "In that jacket, the Team 3 patch." He paused. "My father did 2 tours in the Gulf. He came home because of men who wore that patch. He talked about them the way people talk about things they can't fully explain." He looked at Brennan steadily. "Whatever is in that parking lot right now, it came here for her. Which means the people who wore that patch with her father are treating her like one of their own. You need to think about what that means before you take one more step." Brennan looked at the patch. He looked at Reese. Something in his expression shifted. Not the shift of a man who has been convinced, but the shift of a man who has discovered that the ground is less stable than he had believed when he stepped onto it. He looked at the windows. The light was still there. "Go look," Weston said quietly. The silence stretched. And then June Briggs, who had said her piece and planted her feet and not moved from the spot she had chosen, looked at Brennan with the expression of a woman who has no more patience for the performance. "You're going to let her go right now," June said. "And you're going to sit down, or you're going to find out exactly what's in that parking lot the hard way." Brennan stared at her. In his experience, people did not do what June Briggs was doing. The mechanics of intimidation worked because most people, when confronted with the choice between engagement and withdrawal, chose withdrawal. It was not cowardice, it was arithmetic. You added up the cost of intervention, subtracted it from the cost of non-intervention, and when the margin was clear, you found something interesting to look at in your glass. June Briggs had apparently performed different arithmetic. Brennan opened his mouth. The front door of the iron anchor opened, not with force, with precision. The 12 operators who came through it moved with the practiced economy of people who have done this kind of thing enough times that it has become reflex. They spread through the room in 4 seconds, establishing positions at the perimeter and the exits and the negative space between the steel phantoms and the rest of the bar. They did not touch anyone. They did not speak. They positioned themselves with the quiet, overwhelming efficiency of something larger than the room was designed to hold, and the room reorganized itself around them the way a room must. All 8 steel phantoms went completely still. Garner had remained at Coronado, but before Holt's vehicle had cleared the city limits, Garner had pulled the file again. He had read the declassified paragraph for the 3rd time. He had noted Edmund Brennan's name. He had run the name through the secondary search terminal, not because he knew what he was looking for, but because 11 years behind the operations desk had given him a calibrated instinct for details that want to connect to something. The search returned a service record, separated 1997 Army 75th Ranger Regiment. Beneath it, a sparse civilian record. He cross-referenced it with the incident report from the Iron Anchor call, which included the full legal names of the Steel Phantoms chapter officers from their club registration. President Raymond Edmund Brennan. Date of birth, September 14, 1983. Garner read it twice. Edmund Brennan's son. The man who had Jack Calloway's daughter by the arm in a bar in Flagstaff, Arizona, was the son of the man Jack Calloway had pulled off an extraction point in Kuwait in February of 1991. The man Jack had kept alive with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and the particular variety of will that most men discover they do not possess until the moment they need it. Garner picked up the radio. "Commander Holt," he said, "I have something you need to know before you make entry." In the lead SUV, Holt listened to what Garner told him. He did not respond immediately. The vehicle moved through the desert dark flagstaff visible now on the horizon, its light orange against the black. He was thinking about Jack Calloway at an extraction point alone, buying time he was not sure anyone was coming to receive. He was thinking about Edmund Brennan on a helicopter. He was thinking about a dog tag on a table. He keyed the radio. "Understood," he said. "Maintain approach. 2 minutes out." Brennan's grip on Reese's arm fell away. It was not a decision exactly. It was the body registering a change in certainty before the mind has fully caught up the unconscious release of something that the hands understood was no longer tenable. His hand dropped to his side. Reese did not move. She reached across the table and picked up the dog tag. She closed her hand around it. She looked at Brennan with the expression she had carried throughout the evening and added to it now something that was not triumph or relief or satisfaction. Something quieter than all of those. The expression of a person who has held a very heavy thing for a long time and can feel for the first time that the holding is nearly done. Warren Holt walked through the door of the Iron Anchor last. Part 3, the weight of what was left. Warren Holt walked through the room without looking at the steel phantoms, without looking at June or the bar or the operators already positioned. He walked with the straight-line certainty of a man who has identified what he came for, and everything else is geography. He stopped in front of Reese Calloway. She was standing beside the corner table, the dog tag in her closed hand, her jacket pulled closed. She was 26 years old, and the room was full of people who were larger than her in every measurable dimension, and none of that registered on her face as relevant information. Holt looked at her for one full second. He took in the condition of her jacket, the set of her jaw, the way she was standing. Then he brought his heels together, back straight, and raised his hand to his brow in a salute that had the precision of something delivered, not out of procedure, but out of genuine respect, which is a different thing entirely and visible as such to anyone who has seen both. "Miss Calloway," he said, "Commander Warren Holt. We received the call." He held the salute a full beat before lowering it. "Are you injured?" Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprised she had known something was coming, but something in the territory between gratitude and grief, the two of which had lived close together in her experience for 2 years and had stopped being distinguishable at the borders. "No," she said. "I'm all right." Holt nodded once. He turned. He turned with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who knows the room is watching and does not require the knowledge to change how he moves. He faced Raymond Brennan. Brennan had not moved. The arrogance that had organized his face all evening had evacuated it entirely, and what remained was younger than the arrogance had made it look and considerably more uncertain. He was a large man in a room full of larger presences, and the arithmetic of that had done something to him that no single action could have managed alone. Holt reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded document. He opened it with two precise movements. He did not need to read from it. The information was already in him, assembled during the drive from Coronado. The document was a formality. What it represented was not. "Master Chief Petty Officer Jack Raymond Calloway," he began. His voice carried without effort through the room. "United States Navy, enlisted 1977, completed basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Class 118 Naval Amphibious Base, Coronado, California. Served with Naval Special Warfare Development Group and SEAL Teams 2, 3, and 8 over a career spanning 41 years of active and reserve service." He paused, not for effect, to move from one section to the next with the respect each required. "Recipient of the Navy Cross, the citation reads for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy force, February 27, 1991, classified location, Southwest Asia. While serving as team leader during an extraction operation, Master Chief Calloway sustained 2 fractured ribs and a dislocated right shoulder during initial enemy contact. Despite these injuries, he maintained suppressive fire at the extraction point under continuous hostile fire for 11 minutes, enabling the successful evacuation of 4 wounded team members and 1 attached Army Ranger. He was the last man to board the extraction aircraft. One member of his team, Corporal Thomas J. Crawford, United States Navy, died of wounds sustained during the action. Master Chief Calloway's decision to hold the extraction point was directly responsible for the survival of the remaining personnel. The bar was so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator unit behind the bar was audible. June had both hands flat on the bar top. The couple by the jukebox had turned entirely to face the room, the thing they had spent the last hour trying not to look at, now the only thing worth looking at. The two men at the bar end had not moved in so long, they appeared to have grown into their stools. Holt continued without pause. 2 silver stars, 4 bronze stars with valor, 3 purple hearts. He looked up from the document and looked at Brennan directly. This man spent 41 years doing things in places whose names have never appeared in any newspaper so that people in bars like this one could have the Friday nights they wanted to have. The patch on that jacket you grabbed tonight is not a decoration and it is not a claim. It is a receipt, paid for with more than you have ever put on the table in your life. He stopped. The stopping was deliberate, giving the room a moment to absorb what had been said before adding to it. The Army Ranger that Master Chief Calloway carried to the evacuation aircraft on February 27, 1991, Holt said. His voice dropped, not softer but more concentrated. The man he kept alive at an extraction point with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, while his radio man lay dying beside him and the window was closing. Sergeant First Class Edmund Brennan, 75th Ranger Regiment. The name landed without drama. It did not need drama. It had its own mass, and that mass was sufficient. Raymond Brennan went very still, not the stillness of a man surprised into temporary inaction. The stillness of a man struck in the place where the things he thought he understood about his own life are organized, and who is standing inside the realization that the organization has shifted into something he does not yet have the words for. His father's name. In this room. From this man. He looked at Holt. He looked at the document in Holt's hand. He looked at Reese. And what he found in her face was not what he expected. He had braced without knowing he was bracing for satisfaction, for the expression of someone watching a reversal they had been waiting for. What he found instead was something quieter and harder to receive than satisfaction, something that did not ask anything of him and did not offer him a way to argue with it. She was looking at him with compassion, not the performed kind, the real kind which simply sees you, not the thing you have built around yourself, but what is underneath it. She was looking at him and seeing past the leather vest and the road name and the years of constructing an identity around the idea of being the largest force in whatever room he entered, seeing something underneath all of that she recognized because she had been learning the shape of it in herself for 2 years. He was carrying something he had never been given the language to put down. You knew, he said. It arrived as certainty rather than question. He could see it in the pattern of her behavior across the entire evening, the way she had not reacted when he picked up the dog tag and read the name aloud, the quality of waiting in her that had been there from the first minute. She had known something he did not know, and she had chosen, knowing it, not to use it. I knew your father's name, Reese said. Her voice was even, the voice of someone stating a verifiable fact. My father talked about Edmund Brennan, not often. But every year on February 27th, he talked about the extraction. He talked about the decision he made to stay on that ground until every man who could be taken off it was taken off it. She paused, and he talked about the man he couldn't bring home. She reached into her jacket pocket. The photograph was small, the paper thick and matte with age. Black and white, once closer to sepia, now the edges soft with decades of careful handling. 3 men standing in front of a helicopter, somewhere arid and bright, sun and dust in a pale overcast sky. The man on the left was the youngest, perhaps 20 years old, grinning with the fullness of someone who does not yet know what the next months will cost him. The man in the middle was Jack, recognizable, even young, even in a faded photograph, by the particular quality of attention in his face, the way he held himself as if nothing around him was happening that he had not already accounted for. The man on the right was broader, with a jaw that was the original of the jaw that Raymond Brennan had inherited, smiling in the restrained way of men who protect what they feel by not displaying it entirely. Thomas Crawford, Reese said, indicating the youngest man. My father's radio man. He didn't make it to the helicopter. My father carried him as long as he could carry him, and then he couldn't, and Thomas Crawford didn't come home. She looked at Brennan steadily. Your father did, because my father was still standing when he should have stopped standing. She set the photograph on the table between them. Your father sent this to mine, she said, from the military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, in the spring of 1991, before he came home. There was no letter inside, just the photograph and 2 lines written on the back. He said he thought about what happened every single day. He said his son had been born in 1983. He said the boy's name was Raymond. Brennan looked at the photograph. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that reorganizes the years behind him without asking permission. His hand moved toward it and stopped, as if he was not certain he had the right to touch it. Then he picked it up carefully with a gentleness that bore no relationship to anything else he had done in the last 2 hours, and he held it in both hands and looked at his father's face. Young, uninjured in the photograph at least before the extraction had happened, before the 11 minutes on the ground, before Edmund Brennan had learned what the word owed meant in its deepest and most permanent sense. Brennan's jaw worked. "He took me to the memorial in Washington," he said. His voice had changed entirely. The architecture of intimidation was gone. What was left was the voice of a man talking about something real. Every year on February 27th, until his knees gave out. He never explained it all the way. He said there was a man. He said the man did something that shouldn't have been possible. He said he never stopped thinking about it. He kept his eyes on the photograph. I stood at that wall with him 3 times when I was a kid. He'd stand there for a long time without moving. I never understood it. I was just a boy, and it was just a wall with names on it. Reese watched him. "Thomas Crawford's name is on that wall," she said. Brennan looked up at R. "Your father took you to stand in front of Thomas Crawford's name," Reese said, "because Crawford died in the same action that brought your father home. Because Edmund Brennan understood that his survival had a cost, and the cost was not only borne by the man who carried him. It was borne by every man who held that ground. My father understood the same thing. He carried it for 31 years. She held Brennan's gaze without accusation and without performance. That's why he came to this bar, to sit with it quietly where nobody needed him to explain it. The room absorbed this in silence. Doyle Garner was standing in the doorway. He had come in with the operators and had not advanced past the threshold. He had positioned himself there and watched. He was 54 years old, and he had been wrong tonight in the specific, irreversible way that you are wrong when the evidence is simultaneously this clear and this human. There was no useful response to being wrong in that particular way except to acknowledge it without language. He reached up and removed his cap. He held it at his side. In the language of men who communicate respect through gesture rather than speech, this said everything it needed to say. Cole Weston saw it. He straightened to the final degree the posture that stays in the body long after the uniform has been left behind. The legal process that followed moved with the efficiency of something pre-coordinated. 2 Flagstaff Police Department vehicles had arrived outside in response to Holt's advance call, briefed on the situation in outline only, which was sufficient. The operators provided witness statements with the concise accuracy of professional observers. The assault on Reese Calloway, the physical detention, the deliberate displacement of her property, the grab was documented and unambiguous. Raymond Brennan and 3 of his men were taken into custody with the quietness of people who have spent their remaining energy and have none left for resistance. Brennan did not resist. He went with the deputies with his hands out and his head level and the photograph in his jacket pocket which Reese had told him to keep. He walked toward the door without looking back at her. Then at the threshold he stopped. He turned. He looked at her across the length of the bar. The room had shifted. Operators partially stood down, June back behind the bar, the other patrons slowly remembering how to occupy their own bodies. The space between Reese and the door was open and clear, and Brennan stood in it and looked at her with a face that was not the face he had walked in with. Not a better face necessarily, a more complicated one, which is not the same as better but is often the beginning of it. He nodded, once. The kind of nod that carries no word because no word is adequate to carry what it is trying to convey. Reese looked at him for a long moment. She nodded back. He went through the door. June came around the end of the bar for the second time that night and sat down across from Reese without asking because they were past the point where asking was necessary. She looked at Reese with the expression people wear when the thing they have survived together does not have an established social script and they are not going to invent one. Reese was looking at the dog tag in her hand. The chain was broken. She did not know precisely when it had happened, when Brennan first picked it up, when he set it down out of her reach, when it hit the table. The clasp was intact, but a link 2 inches from it had given way. The break was clean, the kind of clean that means metal has been stressed gradually over a very long time and has finally found the last load it can bear. She turned it in her fingers. Even properly repaired, it would always carry the repair, a slightly different shade of silver, the infinitesimal thickness of metal added to close the gap. It would never be what it had been. The original chain the one Jack had worn during 41 years of service and carried in his pocket in the years after the one that had spent more days against his skin than Reese could calculate, that chain was finished. It had lasted as long as it could last, and then it had stopped. She held the dog tag and the broken chain together in both hands. This was the thing about losses she had learned over the last 2 years. The large ones arrived with their own mass, and you knew them, and you prepared, and you went through them, and came out the other side changed in ways you would spend years mapping. But the small losses that followed, the specific irreplaceable things that broke or wore out or were simply absent one morning, when you reached for them, those arrived without preparation. Those were the ones that caught you at the edge of your breath in the space between one thought and the next. She was not going to cry. She had done her crying in other places at other times in the privacy that grief requires to do its actual work, and she was not going to do it here in a bar in Flagstaff with the night still unresolved around her. But she held the dog tag for a long moment with something in her face that June recognized and did not try to name, because some things do not benefit from being named. Holt came to the table. He stood at the respectful distance of someone who understands they are near the edge of something private. "Your father was one of the finest operators I ever encountered," he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "I want you to know that, not as a statement and not because tonight requires it, but because it is true, independent of tonight." He paused. "The men who came with me tonight, they knew his file long before this evening. What Jack Calloway was, what he did tonight, didn't create that. Tonight only reminded a room of people that they had been in the presence of someone who mattered." Reese looked at him. "He would have hated this," she said. The corner of Holt's mouth moved in the way that is not quite a smile, but comes from the same place. "Yes," he said. "He'd have been out the door before the SUVs stopped." "He would have bought Brennan a beer," Reese said. "After everything. He'd have bought him a beer and asked about his father. He'd have wanted to know how Edmund was doing, whether his knees had gotten better." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "That sounds exactly right." He nodded once, the formal kind, and moved away. The operators began the quiet process of standing down. The room breathed out. Outside, the precise white lights went dark one by one. The parking lot returned to ordinary darkness, the kind lit only by the half-dead neon sign above the door. Reese sat with the dog tag and waited for the air in the room to settle into something she could sit inside. She thought about her father in this chair in this corner, with his back to this wall. She thought about what he had been carrying when he sat here on the evenings she had not been there to see, the weight of Thomas Crawford, specifically the particular and irreducible grief of being the man who survives the thing the man beside you does not. She thought about how he had carried it without display, without performance, in the way that men of his training carry the things they have agreed to carry as a private matter, not to be put down in public, not to be shown. She thought about the promise she had made him. She thought about the hours tonight when she had held it in place against everything that pushed against it. She thought about what it had cost to hold still when the capacity to move was available and fully loaded and waiting. She thought about what her father had told her when she was 15, sitting on the hood of a truck in the desert before dawn, watching the sky change colors. "The hardest thing I ever did was not the most dangerous thing. The hardest thing was holding still when everything in me said to move, knowing that moving was wrong and staying still anyway." She had asked him when you knew it was time to stop holding still. He had been quiet for several minutes. Then he said, "When holding still means someone else pays the price for your restraint. That's the only reason to move. Not because you're angry, not because you're afraid, not because you've been pushed far enough. Only because not moving costs more than moving." She had been pushed far enough tonight several times over. She had not moved. And the cost had been paid as it happened by the people who had chosen to show up for her June, with her laminated card and her steady jaw, Cole Weston, who had made a decision that cost him something real. Holt and his operators, who had driven through the desert dark because the name Calloway meant something that transcended paperwork. She opened her hand. The dog tag lay in her palm. The broken chain pulled around it. She put it in her jacket pocket, stood up, and said goodnight to June. June said goodnight without looking up from the glass she was polishing, and there was a quality in the not looking up that was its own form of acknowledgement, the kind that does not require eye contact to be complete, because the people who have been through something together do not always need to look at each other to confirm that they were there. Reese walked through the iron anchor and out the door. The parking lot was empty except for her old truck at the far end. The night was cold and absolutely clear, the Arizona sky doing what high desert skies do in late October, displaying every star without compromise, unobstructed and complete. The kind of sky that reminds you the universe is not actually interested in the scale of human problems, which is either terrifying or consoling, depending on the night. She stood for a moment beside the truck with her hand in her jacket pocket, the dog tag and the broken chain against her fingers. She thought about her father standing in this same parking lot on evenings she had not been there to see. She thought about him locking his own truck and walking through that door and sitting in that corner and ordering water and being still with what he carried year after year after year until the years ran out. She thought, I understand it now. I didn't before. I do now. She got in the truck and drove home. 3 months and 11 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, when she had no particular reason to go, not the anniversary, not a planned visit, just an instinct she had learned to follow, Reese pushed through the door of the Iron Anchor. The bar was empty except for June and the sound of the dishwasher running in the back. The winter light came through the front windows at a low angle, laying long, pale rectangles across the floor. Reese walked to the corner table. On the chair, her chair, the one with its back to the wall, and its view of the room, there was a small white envelope, plain, standard, positioned at the center of the seat with the deliberateness of something placed rather than left, which is a different thing. She stood and looked at it. Then she picked it up and sat down and opened it. Inside was a length of chain. Sterling silver standard oval links the gauge and finish of military dog tag chain. New, clean, 18 inches, which is the standard length. With it was a piece of paper folded once. She unfolded it. 3 words. The handwriting was deliberate and slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone who does not write by hand often and was taking care with the letters, wanting them to be right. For your father, no signature. She looked at the chain in her palm. She looked at the 3 words. She looked at June, who had appeared from behind the bar at the sound of the chair, and who was watching from across the room with the simple expression of someone who is present. Do you know who left this? Reese asked. June looked at the envelope. It was on the chair when I unlocked this morning. I don't know who came in or when. Reese looked at the 3 words again. She thought about a man in a Flagstaff courtroom and the weeks between the incident and the legal disposition and the way he had held a photograph in his hands with a carefulness that had no connection to anything else he had done that night. She thought about a boy taken to a wall in Washington 3 times before he was old enough to understand what the names on it cost. She thought about the particular way that understanding arrives, not all at once, not in a single moment of clarity, but slowly over years in increments, until one morning you wake up and the weight of it has changed shape. She thought about her father's voice. The reach of what you do extends further than you can see from where you are standing when you do it. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the dog tag. She unclipped the broken chain. She had kept it the way you keep things that cannot and should not be put down, and she threaded the new chain through the ring at the top of the tag. She brought the ends around. She found the clasp at the back of her neck. It caught. The dog tag settled against her sternum. The metal was cool through the fabric of her shirt. The weight of it was exactly as she had expected from the years of holding it. She had known the weight so long that wearing it felt less like addition and more like return. Like something finding the place it had been meant to occupy. She set the broken chain on the table beside her. She would keep it anyway. That was clear. You keep the things that cannot be put down, even when putting them down would be easier, because the things that cannot be put down are the things that made you who you are, and letting them go is not freedom. It is just a different kind of loss. She sat with both hands flat on the table and looked at the room the way her father had looked at it. The scarred bar top with its rings and its history. The low neon behind the bar casting its amber light across the bottles. The jukebox in the corner quiet on a Wednesday afternoon. The light from the front windows lying long and warm across the floor. Winter light lower and more golden than October, moving slowly across the boards, the way light moves when it is not in a hurry to be anywhere else. June set a cup of coffee on the table. Not water, coffee black without being asked and without comment. Reese looked at it. She looked up at June, who was already turning back toward the bar, with the efficiency of a woman who has understood what was needed and provided it and does not require acknowledgement for the understanding. 12 years of knowing Jack Calloway had taught June that the people who deserve the most gratitude were often the ones least comfortable receiving it. Reese picked up the cup. The first sip was hot and real and precisely right for the afternoon that it was. She set the cup down and looked at the room again and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill she had not always possessed and which her father had tried to teach her for years before she understood that the teaching was the point, not the arrival. She thought about Brennan standing at a wall in Washington as a child, not understanding why his father stood so still. She thought about the moment of understanding that must have come when the name Thomas J. Crawford became real to him, when the weight of what his father owed became something he could feel rather than something he had been told about. She thought about the three words written in careful handwriting and left on a chair before the bar opened on a Wednesday morning. She thought about her father buying that beer he would have bought, asking those questions he would have asked, finding the point of human connection that he always managed to find even in the most unlikely places. She thought about the particular quality of generosity that does not announce itself and does not require recognition and simply moves through the world, leaving things slightly better than they were. The way water moving through rock leaves, it's smoother without the rock ever knowing the work was being done. She thought he is still doing it, even now, through the things he left behind and the people those things have touched and the way those people touch other people in turn. The reach of what you do extends further than you can see. The dog tag rested against her chest, against the sternum, exactly where it belonged. Her father's name in pressed steel worn smooth by a life she was still learning the full dimensions of. His blood type, his service number, the faith designation that had meant something specific to him that she had never asked about directly and now could not ask, which was one of the small, permanent losses she carried alongside the larger ones. The light moved across the floor, slow and unhurried the way light moves in the afternoon when the day has made its peace with not being longer than it is. She stayed until the light changed. Then she put on her jacket. She left money on the table for the coffee, more than the coffee cost, because June had done more than pour coffee, and they both knew it, and neither of them would say so. She picked up her keys. She picked up the broken chain and put it in her breast pocket, next to where the dog tag used to sit. She walked through the iron anchor and out into the winter afternoon. The parking lot was full of ordinary light. A few cars, the smell of cold air coming down from the San Francisco peaks to the north, the particular clean cold of high elevation in January. The neon sign above the door hummed its familiar, half-lit hum. She stood beside her truck for a moment. The dog tag was against her chest. The broken chain was in her pocket. Her father had been dead for 2 years, 4 months, and 22 days. She had been coming to this bar on the anniversary of his death for 2 years. She would keep coming. She would come on Wednesdays sometimes too, she thought, when the instinct pointed her here, when she needed to sit in the room that remembered him. She thought about what he had told her about promises that they were not statements of what you planned to do, but commitments to who you intended to be. That keeping them was not about the specific action, but about the continuous choice to remain the person who made them. She had kept the promise. She had held it through a night that tested it at every angle. And on the other side of the holding, she had found not what she expected, relief or vindication or the satisfaction of having been right, but something quieter. The understanding that her father had known something about the long shape of things that she was only beginning to learn the outline of. That the bus and the reaches and the connections between people extended in every direction and across decades in ways that no single person standing in any single moment could fully see or map. Thomas Crawford had not come home. Edmund Brennan had. Jack Calloway had carried both of those facts for 31 years and had made peace with them in the way that people make peace with things that do not fully resolve by continuing to live alongside them, with honesty and without pretense, by sitting in a corner of a bar with a dog tag in your hands on the anniversary of the night. It all happened by being present with what is true, even when what is true is heavy. She had his dog tag now. She had the broken chain in her pocket. She had the new chain around her neck. She had his voice in her head and his hands in her memory, and the knowledge he had given her, all of it, the tactical and the human, the how and the when and the why, living in her body, the way things live in a body when they have been learned early enough and practiced long enough to become part of what you are. She got in the truck. She sat for a moment before starting it, her hands on the wheel looking at the iron anchor through the windshield. The half-lit neon, the gravel lot, the door that she had pushed through on a Friday night in late October and would push through again many times in the years ahead. She thought you did good, Dad, even the parts that cost you most. She started the truck. She drove out of the parking lot onto the road that led back through Flagstaff toward the garage where an engine block was waiting on the lift, half assembled, ready to be finished. She drove with the body tag against her chest and the broken chain in her pocket, and the winter light moving across the desert in long, slow parallels beside the road. The sky above the high desert of northern Arizona was the particular blue of cold January afternoons, deep and clear and indifferent to everything below it in the way that only the sky at elevation achieves. It held no answers. It offered no commentary. It was simply there as it had been there. On every February 27th, her father had stood at a point on the earth and made a decision about what he was going to do next. She drove. The road unspooled ahead of her, familiar and ordinary and entirely sufficient. The dog tag rested against her chest, warm now from her body, the metal no longer cool, but the same temperature as the skin beneath it. She could feel it with each breath, the small, solid weight of it rising and falling with her. Present, constant, exactly where it was supposed to be. Her father had carried it for 41 years. She had the rest of her life.